I want to look for our lesson this morning. We're going to begin kind of an opening text to Hebrews chapter 5. If you're following along, I'd invite you to turn over. We're going to read a couple of verses from Hebrews 5 to kind of introduce our thoughts this morning. Something that I have noticed over, I can't even say the last little while, for a while now, in our so-called modern times, is that there is this idea among the world that this book right here is too old-fashioned. It pertains to things from a long, long time ago, and it doesn't really have much to do with our modern times. We have all these new and modern things that, were never mentioned and things like that. So, we're just, this old book doesn't have much say on our new world, is kind of what the idea is. And I think with our younger people, that's a pretty predominant thought, and going to get worse as this world gets worse, I think. However, we know as Christians that that's not the case at all, that the Bible is the Word of God. It is the everlasting Word of God. He designed it to meet the needs of the first century Christians when the ink was still wet, and He designed it to meet our needs today on the other side of the planet in this highly technological age. And He designed it to meet all of mankind's needs wherever they are and whenever they are. As long as He's going to leave this world spinning around, this Bible gives everything that mankind is going to need. But as we said, there's a lot of people today, and again, young people I can think of especially, saying, but does it pertain to my life? There's things nowadays that the Bible doesn't mention at all. How do I know if those things are okay for me to do or not okay for me to do? Well, of course, the Bible gives us all those sorts of things. It is the owner's manual for this life, and it tells us those things we need to know. So what I'd like to look at this morning is, I think the biblical phrase is discerning between good and evil. How to know, even if something is super modern, just came out or whatever, does the Bible, how can we tell whether we as Christians should be involved in that or not? In Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, the Hebrew writer says, knowing these things doesn't automatically happen. Just because I became a Christian, I believed, repented, confessed, and was baptized, that doesn't mean, bam, now I know everything that I'm supposed to do and supposed to not do. As a matter of fact, I remember very clearly, for me as a new Christian, I was a young adult, 24 years old, and I was completely confused. The preacher every lesson would, and I was in church every time I could, but the preacher would always, he's saying some from here and some from here and some from over here, and I could never keep up trying to follow, and by the end of the lesson, I'm like, well, I wish I could have got more out of that, but it just kind of went, and I was always kind of confused. But see, what it does, the Hebrew writer says, is it takes a little time, and it takes a little experience. In Hebrews 5, beginning in verse 12, he says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. Verse 14 is our focus. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age or are mature, that is, who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. See, that reason of use, what that is that's experience. That's practice. You have learned things as you've gone along. I saw something the other day that said, yes, we all want wisdom, but how do we gain wisdom? Usually wisdom comes from making the wrong choice and making bad mistakes or seeing others around us do it. So sometimes that wisdom comes hard, but it doesn't come instantly, that's for sure. This morning we'd like to look at a few ways that we can look at if there's a situation or a subject that we're not sure where I should be with this as a Christian, some biblical concepts that will help us decide where we should be on that matter. Or something. Okay, let's jump into our lesson. Again, I want to look at things. If I am not sure of what I should do, and I've thought of really 4 groups of people that I think this lesson especially applies to. First off, we all know we have a whole lot of young people in this room, in this congregation. Not all of them here right now, but we have a lot of young people in this congregation. And I think this could pertain to them really well. There's going to be things come up in life. Well, now, I'm not sure what the Bible says because I'm still real young, or I don't think the Bible says anything about that. How do I know whether this is a good thing for me or not? Second off, we have some new Christians who maybe they're not all that young, but they are fairly new Christians. We have that in our congregation. Third, we have the category I think I fall into, and that's ones that I'm not a new Christian or a young Christian, but I'm not near as mature of a Christian as I should be either. And then four, we have some people in this audience who are older Christians, are more mature Christians. And it would be easy to think, well, now maybe this doesn't apply to me as much. But I would say quite the opposite. I think it applies to you even more because your influence over the younger people, over the newer Christians, is going to be immense. And I just, as someone who watches young people for a living, I cannot express to us older people strongly enough the course that these young people's life takes, whether they stay Christians or not, whether they're strong Christians or weak Christians, a huge part of that is going to be the influence of us adults in this room. The influence, how they see us speak to each other, the way we live our lives, is going to be a huge part of the influence on these young people. So don't think, oh, well, those aren't my kids or those aren't my grandkids or anything like that. Our Christian influence will be a huge factor in their life. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the lesson now. First off, if I'm looking at something and I'm not sure whether or not this is something I should partake in or not, I've got to make a decision. Well, obviously, the first thing I need to know is it a thing that's clearly condemned in the Bible? That's the first easy one. Is it clearly condemned in the Bible? The Bible has multiple places where in the New Testament certain things are specifically described as not being something that Christians should have anything to do with. For example, over towards the end of Galatians, in Galatians chapter 5, down in verse 19, there's a list there. Paul writes, "Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, and revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in times past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit," well, let's just pause right there. You can also find a similar list over in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3 through 7. Now, if the things that I'm trying to figure out is something that's mentioned in that list, well, then I'm done. That settles the matter. As far as a Christian is concerned, there is no room for debate whatsoever when the Scriptures clearly condemn a certain practice. But of course, the Scriptures can't list every single thing. If it would, the book would be unending, and we have new things being invented now that we wouldn't have believed years ago. So the second thing I would say we need to look at is, well, if it's not clearly condemned in the Bible, is it similar to something that's condemned in the Bible? If we're here in this passage we were just in, I think there's a very important phrase that I've never paid attention to. In verse 21, right in the middle of this list of bad things, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. And the like. It means and stuff like that. So we had adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, and the like. Things that are like that. If it's something like something that is mentioned there, then we should stay out of it. Now, I think that could clear up some of our so-called modern problems. I have heard people say, well, it's perfectly fine for a Christian to smoke marijuana. Now, time out. I'm not talking about for actual medicine. Yes, we know it has actual medical purposes. Not talking about that at all. I'm talking about recreational use. Well, the Bible doesn't say you can't just get high. Well, no, the Bible doesn't say you can't just get high. But is smoking marijuana to get high not like being drunk? Well, yeah, it's just like it. When Paul wrote in verse 21, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, I think sitting around getting high for the fun of it would definitely qualify as and the like. Being drunk is clearly condemned in Scriptures. Being high for the fun of it, on whatever drug it is, would definitely fall under that exact same category. So, as a young Christian, that ought to help me, or a new Christian, or whatever the case may be, that ought to help me make that decision. If it's like something that the Bible condemns, I need to stay away from that. I might even compare whatever this item is I'm looking at. Maybe I compare it to the good things. You know, the passage we just read, beginning in verse 19 of Galatians 5, he said this category was the works of the flesh. So we have over here this category, the works of the flesh, that I've read twice. Now I won't read it again. But in verse 22, the very next words, he says, but the fruit of the Spirit, and he gives a whole other category. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. So you might compare whatever this is, this thing that you're trying to figure out, maybe you compare it to, is this more of a works of the flesh type item, or is a works of the flesh type item, or more of a works of the Spirit type item? That might help us decide too. Third thing I think we ought to look at is, does it hurt my conscience? If doing this thing hurts my conscience, I probably need to be worried about that. Paul wrote to the young man Timothy over in 1 Timothy, and he talked about several times there, he talked about the importance of having a good conscience. 1 Timothy chapter 1, down in verse 5. Now, the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. Skip down to verse 18 and 19. This charge I commit to you, son Timothy, according to the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you may wage the good warfare, having faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected. Concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck. And we could also flip over to chapter 3 and pick up verse 9. Holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. If we are violating our own conscience in this thing that's wrong, you know, I really, really know I shouldn't do this, but, and you know what we tell ourselves, oh, it's just this one time. Or, well, you know, I do all the other stuff right. This is just this one thing. If it violates our conscience, that should scare us. We should have red flags popping up. We should have sirens going off. If it's violating our conscience, we should be scared. You can turn just right over to the next chapter, 1 Timothy 4, and look at what he said in verse 1 and 2. Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. You know what he's talking about here? It's when on your flesh you get something burned so bad that a scar is left remainder and you can't really feel anything. There may be people in the room who have a wound like that. It doesn't hurt. You can't feel anything because it's been seared over. You know, a sear, it just kind of kills those nerve endings and you don't feel it anymore. You know, it kind of can compare it to calluses. I don't have calluses anymore because I don't work very hard. But used to, when I was younger, had calluses. You know how it is. You can't really feel past that callus. Now, imagine that seared where you can't feel it. He's talking about your heart. You're doing this thing over, and your conscience, you're searing it over to where you can't even feel it anymore. Why? It's, you know, whatever it is thing that you're involved in, it doesn't even bother you anymore. That scares me. It scares me that if I start doing this one thing, then maybe I'll do it a little bit more. You know, it was going to be just one time, and then maybe I'm going to do it a little bit more. And then I get to where it's kind of I'm doing it all a habit. And pretty soon my heart is seared over to where I don't even feel it. It doesn't bother me at all. And now I'm a Christian, saying I'm a Christian, telling people I'm a Christian, showing up for church, praying Christian, and I've seared my heart over to where I don't even feel that sin anymore. Now, think about that and read 1 Timothy 4, verse 1 and 2 again, and see if you want to be associated with that, if you want that in your life. That should scare us a lot. Paul said over in Romans 14, verse 23, that doing something, when you doubt its righteousness, it's right that you're pretty sure it's wrong, it violates your conscience, that's a sin. So we need to make sure that we stay away from the things that we feel could be a sin that violates our conscience. My next item, and this is a huge one for me personally, that is, again, the topic is, if I have, whether I'm a young Christian, a new Christian, whatever my status may be, if there's a subject that I just am not sure what to do, I think one of the biggest things we can do as a Christian, one of the biggest blessings we have on this earth as a Christian, is we have around us more mature, more experienced, more wisdom brothers and sisters that we can talk to. And I think talking to a more mature Christian about this subject, if you're a young person, I cannot tell you how valuable this is. Now, of course, just because some more mature Christian told you something doesn't mean it's automatically right. And if they're a more mature Christian, they'll be the first person to say so. Just because I said it doesn't make it's absolutely right or wrong. But what did we read over in Hebrews 5:14, our opening text? By reason of use, they're in a position to discern. These people have made these mistakes before, and they've seen around them others who have made these sorts of mistakes. I kind of feel like I'm starting to fall into that category. You know, again, for my job, I watch people, and I'm involved with lots and lots of people, and I'm starting to see mistakes that people make a lot. And I'm starting to see these kind of categories of things that I've seen over and over. But see, as a younger person, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to, and there are people in this room, numerous people in this room who I've gone to over the years and said, well, you know, can you help me with this? Or do you know anything about this? Or have you ever been in this type of a situation before? Or, you know, I'm trying to figure this out. And the experience and the wisdom that older people have, the value of that cannot be overstated. Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3, down in verse 17. Brethren, join in following my example, and note those who so walk as you have us for a pattern. Paul says, now remember, they didn't have, the Philippian brethren, the first century Christians, they didn't have a Bible to open up. Some of these letters were floating around and being circulated. Some of the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were able to be seen, but they didn't have a Bible that everybody could just pop open and check. So they're trying to, you know, I think it's hard to be a Christian when I've got all the instructions right there. How do I figure all this out? How do I know what to do? All the instructions are right there. Imagine if you were a first century Christian, you didn't have all the instructions right there. How would you know what to do or not do? There's all these people floating around saying, oh, you have to do these Old Testament things. Oh, no, you need to do this from this pagan religion. How do I know what's right and what's wrong? Paul said, right there in that verse, he said, watch what I do and follow my example. Look for other people who are acting like me and walking like I do and follow their example. Again, going back to the topic of being a young Christian, as I said, I became a Christian at age 24. Was very interested, was reading my Bible, was coming to church every opportunity I had, but was still pretty lost. And it stayed that way for a couple of years before I started getting a clue. You know, the one thing that was able to help me, you know, when I'm still flipping back and forth and I'm trying to find up from down in this Bible, the one thing that really was far more valuable than I understood at the time is all the Christians in the room who were older, more mature, experienced Christians. And when I wasn't learning as much from the Bible because I was still trying to figure out up from down, I was learning volumes from those people. The things they said, the things they didn't say, the way they treated each other, the way they didn't treat each other. the things they did and didn't do, the places they'd go and wouldn't go. It was their example, and I wasn't a little kid. I was 24 years old. I had a wife and 2 kids. Well, 1.5 at the time. Being able to watch those older people and learn from them had more to do with my first years as a Christian than the Bible did, because I was still pretty, trying to figure out how it worked, and probably had more to do with the lessons that I heard 3 times a week. The example of Christians is absolutely tremendous. So I really want us to think about that from both sides. From if you're a new young person, the wisdom that you can gain from going and talking to your older brothers and sisters, there is nothing else in the world as valuable as that. And for those of us who are the older brothers and sisters, the value of your example may be one of the most important things you do in your lifetime. And so we need to make sure that we guard that and we use it wisely. Of course, we all know Titus chapter 2. I'm not going to turn over there and read. Paul instructed Titus that the younger should look to those that are older. The young women look up to the older women. The young men look up to the older men and learn from them. So if I'm a younger or newer Christian or whatever it is, and I need some help with something, don't forget the incredible value that you have in being able to talk to older and more experienced brethren, people who have been there and done that and seen other people do it. Their value cannot be overstated. Now let's switch gears just a little bit to my next one. Again, let me bring back, after I chase that rabbit, let me come back to what my original topic is here. I'm a Christian trying to figure out whether I should or shouldn't do something. Here's something else I think that we ought to think about. And this, I think, pertains to us older Christians as well. Does what I'm doing hinder my influence on other people? Now, we just talked about how my influence on the younger people could be really valuable, but what about the people outside of the church? Every single one of us is surrounded every single day by all kinds of people that we're around. We each have our own little circle of people we're around all the time, people that know us, know who we are. Hopefully they all know that we're a Christian because, we act a little different, we dress a little different, we speak a little different, those sorts of things, different from this world. So what about my influence on those people? Now, Paul said, if you look over in 1 Corinthians, Paul talked a little bit about worrying about his influence on other people. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I want to go down to verse 19. Paul was using his own life as an example. He said, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." Win meaning getting them to be Christians. "And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. And to those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you." What is Paul saying here? Is Paul kind of being two-faced? Is he saying, well, I act one way towards some people and I act another way toward... No, that's not what he's saying at all. He said, I have to put thought into how I present myself and my influence. If he's going to go talk to Jewish people, Paul's habit was whenever he entered a new town, he went straight to the temple. What are you going to find in the temple? You're going to find a whole bunch of Jewish people, born and raised in their blood, literally, in the Old Testament. So when he goes to preach to them, how's he going to preach Jesus to them? He preaches to them Jesus out of the Old Testament. He's going to talk about the scriptures that have prophecies, all the things that pointed toward the Messiah, all the things that proved that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. He used the Old Testament passages to, as the Jews, I was a Jew. But then he says, as to those without law, the people who they weren't Jewish at all. For example, when he's in Rome, he's talking to a bunch of people who were pagans. They don't know anything about the Old Testament. He can't use the Old Testament prophecies. They don't give two hoots about Old Testament prophecies. So when he goes to preach to them, what does he do? Well, we can read about him on Mars Hill, where he says, you've got all these idols and statues around here. I'm here to talk to you about the one that you don't know about, the one true almighty God, creator of this universe. He didn't use Old Testament scriptures with them. He talked about God and how he created things and all that. So his influence is what he's saying. I use, different things for different audiences. And then in chapter 10, he says, the very last verse of chapter 10, and then the very first verse of chapter 11. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. My influence on other people is a huge thing. And I don't think we normally think about that. I know for a fact I don't think about that very much. But our example as a Christian to other people is huge. I remember when I think I just used this example last month, but I'm going to use it again. I remember as a very, very new Christian, Joe Heisel giving a lesson, and he said a phrase that kind of cracked me up. He said, for some people, you may be the only Bible they ever read. And I thought that was kind of a silly thing. But as I've gotten older, I've heard that phrase a lot of times, I think that's more and more true every day. This world is less and less and less interested in the things of God. We know that in the United States of America, less than 50% of people now, this is the latest data from 2023, less than 50% of people claimed any religious affiliation whatsoever. I'm not talking about they're not Church of Christ. I'm not talking about they're not Protestants. They're not evangelists. No, I'm talking about no religion. None. Not Christian, not Muslim, not Catholic, not voodoo, not nothing. It was something like 48 or 49% of people claim that they have some religious affiliation. Now, I grew up, most of us we were in a country where maybe some people didn't go to church, but most everybody claimed that they were Christian. I'd like to go back and look at 30 years ago, what was that percentage? It was probably sky high. But it's going down every day. Less people in America are interested in religion than ever before. And the young people, the stats are out, just through the roof. Now think about your example as a Christian in front of these other people. Because I'm telling you, we probably stick out. I don't want to say like a sore thumb, but it's probably not all that much different. Do you dress different than the people that you're around most of the time? Probably. Do you not talk the way some of them talk? Hopefully. Do you not go some of the places they go? Hopefully. If the people around me can't tell that I'm a Christian, I'm not doing a good enough job. It would be my opinion. So, my influence on them. Now imagine one of those people, they get to a place in their life where they're like, man, I really feel like I need to get right with God. How do I even do that? What should I do? Is there a good possibility that they can remember you? Hey, that one guy? Or I know that one lady, and I know they're a Christian. Maybe I could talk to them. Maybe they could kind of point me in the right direction. I think those possibilities always existed. I think now and in the coming years, those possibilities are going to exist even more. Our influence as a Christian is going to become a bigger and bigger deal because less and less people are going to be interested. There's that well-known passage over in 1 Peter chapter 3 where Peter talks about, here, let me read it right quick. It's 1 Peter 3, the first two verses. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives. What is he saying? If the wife is a Christian and her husband's not, what should she do? She should continue being a Christian, because her good example, he may end up becoming a Christian simply because of her example. And we all know that's true. If you've been alive very many years and paid attention, we've seen that happen in the church. Now imagine that wife is you and the husband is the people around you. Your life and the way you live your life, someone may become a Christian and their soul may be saved because of your influence. What he's saying there about the wife's example is also very true of the Christian example. So, back to my subject. If I'm trying to decide whether I should do this thing or not do this thing, I think I need to stop as a Christian and think about, does it hinder my example for other people? I'll use a silly example. I know it's a silly example, but it fits. How about hanging out at the bar? I'm not getting drunk. I'm not even drinking. I'm just hanging out at the bar. I just go and have a Dr. Pepper. Now, what could I possibly be doing wrong? Now, what happens the next time I invite somebody to church? Oh, that guy thinks he's such a Christian. I see him at the bar every Friday night. Why would I have anything to do with him? Why would I have anything to do with the kind of church he goes to? I know good and well he's at the bar every Friday. Now, I wasn't actually drinking, but did I hinder my influence? Sure. Probably nobody that knows me is going to have anything to do with my type of Christianity, because my influence hurt that. So, things in our lives, I think we need to think about, does this hinder or help my Christian influence on other people around us? And again, I'm going to say, I think this is becoming more and more and more important as this world changes. And then, of course, for my last one, I'll say, this is the one that I usually use for my own self. Whenever I have a decision to make, a hard decision, maybe it's not anything of a scriptural nature at all, I try to always ask myself, what's the most Christian thing I could do? Maybe I'm thinking about taking a job or not taking a job, moving to a different place, not moving to, whatever the little subject may be, tiny or maybe huge. If I can stop and ask, and it could be things that, I have fretted over and fretted over. I've thought about it and thought about it. It's been going on for a long time. When I stop and ask myself, what's the most Christian thing I could do in this situation? You know what? I've found that example problem usually clears up real quick. Because usually it's real easy to think of which one is the more Christian of those two things. Remember, Luke told us over in Luke chapter 6, down in verse 40. Luke 6 in verse 40, Jesus says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher." We call ourselves disciples of Christ or followers of Christ. In this wording, it's a student following a teacher. Our job as a Christian in this world is to live our lives as Christ-like as possible. We need to be like Jesus. So thinking about, what's the most Christian thing I could do? Or maybe even to make it a little simpler, what would Jesus say is the right thing to do in this situation? Philippians 2 verse 5 tells us that we need to have the mind of Christ. What that means is I've practiced and worked on and learned enough that I know what is the most Christian thing to do. So we went over a few things here about properly discerning between good and evil. There are things right now in our lives, the internet, all sorts of things that are completely different from biblical things. And yet the biblical concepts fit them perfectly, just like God knew they would, and just like He arranged for so that we would have these things to use in our lives. We can't ever think, it's so different now that won't pertain. I promise you, no matter what the situation is, these things in the Bible still pertain. So I'll close with a few questions. First off, and again, this is a lot geared towards the younger and newer Christians, but we as older Christians also need to be thinking about it from the other direction. First off, do you have some older Christian who you feel comfortable going to for advice. Every single one of us needs that. And I know that I'm starting to get all this gray in my beard and losing my hair and all that sort of stuff. But you know what? I still feel a very strong need to have older Christians I can go to for advice. I thought that was only going to be when I was a new Christian. It's not at all. I will admit sometimes it's hard to find older Christians. It's getting a little more difficult as I get older. But we all need to have an older Christian who we feel good about going to them for advice. Secondly, do I usually give enough thought to the effect of my actions on other people? Do I just say what I want to say and do what I want to do? Or do I think about my Christian example, whether it's in front of my brothers and sisters or my family or the people in this world? Third, am I keeping a good conscience in all that I do? The things that I'm doing, whether it's around people or it's the things I'm doing all by myself where nobody's around, is my conscience clear with the way I'm living in my life? And then fourthly, will I ask myself when I'm in doubt, what would Jesus want me to do in this situation? I think if we can think of things like that, younger people, I think it would be a great way to strengthen your Christian life and be able to live closer to Jesus. And us older people, if we'll think about how important those things are in our life so that we can be helping the younger and newer Christians, I think everyone benefits, the church especially.